The lesson of wealth. I am an old man now, but I remember this story well. It happened many years ago when my son was still a young boy. He was about 10 years old, full of questions and curiosity. He always wanted to learn new things and explore the world. We lived in a big house in the city. We had everything we needed: good food, beautiful clothes, and a warm home. My son never had to worry about anything. If he wanted a new toy, he got it. If he wanted nice clothes, we bought them. He had a comfortable life, but I felt something was missing. One evening, as we sat in our large dining room, my son asked me, "Father, are we rich?" I smiled and said, "Yes, my son, we have everything we need." He nodded, but did not seem satisfied. I could see that he had more questions in his mind. I decided it was time to teach him an important lesson. I wanted him to see how different life was for others. I wanted him to understand what true wealth meant. One day I said, "We are going on a trip, my son." He was excited and asked, "Where are we going, Father?" I smiled and answered, "To a small village far from here." He was curious, but did not ask more questions. Early the next morning we packed a small bag and left the city in our car. The roads changed as we drove. The tall buildings disappeared, and soon we saw open fields, trees, and rivers. My son looked out the window, watching everything with wide eyes. After a long journey, we arrived at a tiny village. The houses were small and simple, made of wood and bricks. The streets were narrow and dusty. The people wore plain clothes and worked hard in the fields. Some carried baskets of fruit, while others walked with their animals. Children played outside, running barefoot on the ground, their faces full of joy. My son looked around in silence. I could see the surprise in his eyes. This was a world very different from his own. I wondered what he was thinking. Our adventure had just begun. We stayed in the village for 2 days. A kind family welcomed us into their small home. Their house was not big like ours. It had only 2 rooms, with simple wooden furniture and no expensive decorations. The roof was made of straw, and the floor was hard and uneven. But the family was happy, smiling as they invited us inside. The father of the family worked in the fields all day. He woke up early, before the sun, and walked for miles to tend to his crops. The mother cooked food over a small fire and made clothes by hand. Their children helped with chores, carrying water from the river and feeding the animals. They had no expensive toys, no television, and no fancy clothes. But they laughed and played together, running around freely in the open fields. That evening we sat outside under the stars. The village had no street lights, only the soft glow of lanterns. My son looked up at the sky in amazement. "Father, the stars are so bright here," he said. "In the city I never see so many." I smiled and nodded. "That is because there are no bright lights to hide them," I explained. The next morning we walked to a nearby river. My son watched as the village children jumped into the water, splashing and laughing. "They don't have a swimming pool, but they have a whole river," he said softly. He was beginning to see things differently. Later, we visited the fields where the villagers worked. They had no machines, only their hands and simple tools. But they worked together, singing as they harvested their crops. My son watched in silence, deep in thought. That night, as we lay on thin mats inside the small house, my son whispered, "Father, I think I am learning something." I smiled in the darkness. "Good," I said. "Tomorrow we go home, and then you will tell me what you have learned." The next morning we packed our bags and prepared to leave. The kind family stood at their door, waving and smiling. They did not have much, yet they gave us warm food and a place to sleep. My son looked at them one last time before stepping into our car. As we drove through the village, my son was quiet. He watched the small houses, the open fields, and the children playing with sticks and stones. He did not look at his phone or ask to listen to music like he usually did. He was thinking. After a long drive, we reached home. Our house was large and filled with expensive things. The floor was smooth and polished, the lights were bright, and the furniture was soft and comfortable. But my son did not run inside excitedly. Instead, he stood at the door, looking around. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I asked him, "So, what did you learn from this trip?" He took a deep breath and looked at me. "Father," he said, "I used to think we were rich and they were poor, but now I see things differently. We have a small pool, but they have a big river. We have fancy lights, but they have the stars. Our yard is surrounded by walls, but they have endless fields. They may not have money, but they have freedom, happiness, and family." I stared at him, surprised by his words. He was right. We had more things, but they had more life. I had taken him on this trip to teach him something, but in the end, he was the one who taught me a lesson. That night, as I lay in bed, I could not stop thinking. My son had opened my eyes. Maybe we were not as rich as I had thought. Maybe true wealth was something different. That night, I could not sleep. My son's words stayed in my mind. I had always believed that having money made us rich, but now I was not so sure. I thought about the people in the village. They had no luxury, no big houses, no expensive cars, yet they smiled more than we did. They shared what they had, even with strangers. The next morning, I sat in the garden, watching the sun rise. My son came and sat beside me. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Father, can we go back to the village someday?" His question surprised me. "Why?" I asked. He smiled. "I liked it there. People were kind, they had time for each other, they were happy." I looked at him, wondering when he had grown so wise. "Yes," I said, "we can go back." That day, I decided to make a change. I wanted to live differently. I wanted to enjoy simple things, to spend more time with my family, and to appreciate life in a new way. Money could buy many things, but not true happiness. A few days later, I told my son, "We will do something special." He looked at me with curious eyes. "What is it?" he asked. I smiled. "Wait and see." I had learned something important from this trip. Sometimes the richest people are not the ones with the most money, but the ones who know how to enjoy life. And my son had helped me see that. A week later, I took my son to a small farm outside the city. The air was fresh, and the land stretched far and wide. Birds sang in the trees, and a gentle breeze moved through the fields. My son looked around with excitement. "Why are we here, Father?" he asked. I smiled and said, "I want to show you something important." We walked to a small wooden house where an old farmer lived. He welcomed us warmly and invited us inside. The house was simple, with handmade furniture and pictures of his family on the walls. His wife brought us tea, and we sat together, talking. The farmer told us about his life. He worked hard every day, but he was happy. He had enough food, a loving family, and good friends. "I do not have much money," he said, "but I have everything I need." My son listened carefully, his eyes full of wonder. After we left the farm, my son was quiet. Then he said, "Father, I think I understand now. Happiness is not about how much we own. It is about how we live." His words made me smile. He was learning something that had taken me years to realize. That evening, we sat in our garden, watching the stars. My son pointed at them and said, "Look, Father, the stars are free and they shine for everyone." I nodded, feeling proud of him. He was right. Some of the best things in life cannot be bought. They must be felt and cherished. The next morning we returned to the city. I looked at my son and asked, "What did you learn from our trip?" He smiled and said, "I learned that there is more to life than just money. People in the city have many things, but they are often not happy. The people in the village may not have much, but they are rich in love and happiness." I was amazed by how much my son had understood. At such a young age, he saw the truth that many adults fail to see. His words stayed with me. As we arrived at our home, my son ran to the garden. He looked at the flowers, the trees, and the small pond. He said, "We have everything we need right here, Father." His words made my heart fill with gratitude. I realized that my son had taught me an important lesson. We don't need to travel far to find happiness. Sometimes the best things are right in front of us. We just need to see them. That night, as I watched my son sleep, I promised myself that I would never forget what I had learned from him. Happiness is not about wealth, but about love, kindness, and the simple joys of life. And that, I knew, was the greatest treasure of all.